So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for getting up so early and attending this. I'm not a morning person, so I'm going to try and my caffeine will kick in, hopefully, as we go along through this presentation, so just all bear with me. Thank you for having me. This is my second ever DevOps Days conference. I generally speak at Java conferences. So, yeah, thanks for having me, and it's great to be back in Warsaw. Last time I was here was when I worked at IBM, at IBM Think in Warsaw. So, today, again, I'm happy that you're all here to listen about licenses. I will try and make this as interesting as possible. It's something we all have to pay attention to, but we try and not think about it as much as possible. A little bit about me. So my name's Jamie Coleman. I am a developer advocate for Sonatype. My background, I have a computer science degree. I worked for IBM for 6-7 years. I worked in Java on WebSphere. My first job was actually on mainframes before WebSphere. Worked on WebSphere, worked on their containerization solutions. We were actually the first product in IBM, I think, to be containerized, which was quite cool. So I worked on that, creating the pipelines for that. And that was when Docker had just become a thing. So I've been doing containers for a very, very long time. Hands up, anyone heard of Sonatype in here? Anybody? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, cool. So Sonatype, if you don't know us, we are a software supply chain security company. If you use Java, you will probably know Maven. Maven Central is something we run. We run this on AWS. This actually started out, my boss who created Sonatype, he was one of the first contributors of Maven. He actually created Maven Central. It was actually running on a computer under his desk for about 2 years, and as you can imagine, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. It's the main Java repository in the world. So as you can imagine, it now runs on AWS, which costs us an absolute fortune. I think this year we just hit 2 trillion downloads from Maven Central. So you can imagine how much that costs Sonatype, but we do this just for the community. We make no money off Maven Central. It's just there. We just host it to, help the Java community. You might be familiar with some of our other products at Sonatype. We were the first ever repository in the artifact repository in the world, which was Nexus repository. But we have lots of other things. Nexus Firewall is something that helps block bad things getting into your system, vulnerability scanners, etc., etc. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to start off talking a little bit about why we all love open source, why we consume it quite a lot. What are some of the issues of using this mass amount of open source? A little bit about what software licenses are, different types of software licenses. I will then talk a little bit about what software composition analysis and how that can help us with licensing. A little bit about SBOMs. Then I'll talk about all the licenses we use every day and what we need to be careful of, any licenses that may cause us problems, and then a little bit about automation and any legislation that's coming down in the EU, in the US, and the UK that might affect our use of open source. So, as we all know, open source is amazing. I presume we all use open source somewhere. We know the freedoms of open source. We know why we use open source. Essentially, it gives us the ability to study it, copy it, modify and distribute it. If you've got a big open source project, you have a big community there trying to find bugs, working in different locations around the world. Essentially, most open source software, and a lot of the reasons we use it is because it's free. We all like free stuff. And generally, like I mentioned, lots of people collaborating together. A lot of open source libraries, things are created by Red Hat, IBM, Spring, blah, blah, blah. They're all big corporations. So a lot of the open source libraries we use on a daily basis, a lot of the open source tools we use, like Kubernetes, they're all backed by big corporations. So we know not only are they working on them, but the community is also working on them as well. So yes, open source is amazing. Imagine if we had to write all the codes that goes into applications, we had to write all the tools, all the functionality we take for free. I mean, today, software engineers, software developers, 90% of the applications we create is not our code. We have borrowed that code from someone else. We've taken it from the internet, and we've included it into our applications. So nowadays, we are only writing about 10% of what is in our applications, which is great. Imagine if we had to go and write that other 90%. It would take a lot of our time. So open source is amazing in regards to this because it means people from all over the world can share open source stuff. But then there becomes issues. So if you can imagine in terms of licensing, So an average Java project will have around 150 dependencies. Those dependencies could have around 10 releases, 10 updates per year. That is 1,500 releases, updates we have to manage. Those licenses can possibly change with every update, with every release. And that is just for one Java project. A lot of people, a lot of companies will have lots of projects, lots of applications running. So this is a big overhead. It creates a lot of technical debt for us. And it's something that stifles innovation. We just want to get on with our jobs. We just want to make our organizations run better. We want them to perform better. We want to make better applications, and we want to do it quicker. But this overhead is getting bigger and bigger. The more open source code we consume, the more overhead it is. And then we have the problem of transitive dependencies. So this is Spring Boot, for example. We import this one dependency into our application. That dependency will pull in these dependencies. Those dependencies will pull in these dependencies, and so on and so forth. And this is a problem, especially in terms of licensing, because all these dependencies can have different licenses. And we have to be very, very careful we are not pulling in a dependency that might affect us legally and get us in trouble. So lots and lots of things to worry about. And then, of course, now we're in the age of microservices with containers. So now we have lots of these things running around everywhere, even more licenses to track, even more dependencies to manage. So it gets more and more difficult, especially in this kind of architecture, to keep track of all this stuff. I mean, when this was just one big application, it's a lot easier to see what's in one application than to see what's in hundreds of applications. So even though we're trying to make, I don't know if we're trying to make our lives easier with microservices, but we're trying to make our businesses better, I would say our organizations better. But as a result of that, it might make everything a lot more complex. So software licenses, we probably all know what they are, but I'm going to go through them anyway, just in case anyone here doesn't know what a software license is. It's essentially a legal document that sets out permissions on software. So you download a piece of software, you download an open source dependency, and the software license is basically the rules set out for that thing you are downloading. So these permissions are basically set to kind of protect the intellectual property of the person who created it, because you don't want to go and create something and then it's been used in the world and it's been abused and modified to things you don't want to happen. Some licenses do even contain pricing and terms of how to make payment, but that is usually a separate document. The main points a software license has is if the software can be copied, modified, distributed, how the software can be used, where and how it can be installed. So can it be installed in a container? Can it be installed on the cloud? Things like that. Any copyrights to that license that apply, who owns that software, and the duration of this legal document, essentially. So how long you would be allowed to use it for, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there are different types of licenses. And they generally go, I've put them here from least restrictive to the most restrictive. So the least restrictive licenses we have at the beginning are public domain licenses. These are basically software that is completely free to be modified, used, and distributed. These are our favorite licenses because we can pretty much do what we want with that downloaded software, with that downloaded open source dependency. We can do what we want with it. LGPL, this is a bit different. So you can use the code, but you have to apply, and you can apply any license to that code. So for example, I can take that code and I can relicense it with another license in most circumstances, which is okay. But then we get to permissive, which gets a bit more restrictive. So they will have restrictions on it in terms of what you can do, in terms of modifying it, etc. Generally, if I download some software or an open source dependency, and it has a permissive license, I would generally have to apply that license to the software I'm including it in, which could be a problem for many reasons. I'll talk about that later. Copyleft, again, same kind of thing. It has to kind of include the license you pulled in, which can be a problem because it means the software you're trying to create will now have to use that license of anything you've pulled into it. And a lot of people don't understand that, and a lot of people fall into this trap and get into legal trouble. And proprietary is basically you can't modify it. You can't really copy it. You can't distribute it. It's kind of if I went and bought, the new version of Office. That's kind of proprietary software that is restrictive. It means I can't modify it. I can't distribute it. I have to pay for it. It's not free. So yeah, just going over these public domain licenses. These licenses have pretty much zero restrictions. So these are our favorite licenses. Any open source software you use, this is the preferred license we want to consume. You can use and modify the software, but not all. Be careful, because if you find some software or open source software, open source dependency that has no license attached to it, it does not mean it's part of the public domain license. So be careful there, because just because you find a piece of software you can't find a license for does not mean it's part of this. So do make sure what you're consuming is you're allowed to do so. LGPL, developers have the right to include open source libraries into their code and apply a new license on top, like I mentioned. If the code is from a library or is copied and modified, then the original GPL license is applied. So you essentially consume it, but if you modify it and you copy that code specifically, then you might have to reapply the license to your whole software. So that's the second one. Permissive licenses. These are the most common types of licenses we see every day. These licenses require preserving license notices. So if I pull something in, I have to include that in the software I'm creating because I've used it. So it's essentially like a contract to say, I will do that. And basically, it will say how the software can be used. So it doesn't mean you can use it any way you want. And also trademarks and copyrights you have to also include as well. So, but this is generally the most used licenses we see today in the world. Copyleft is where it gets a bit harder. Essentially, you will have to apply the license that comes with this to your software. The problem is with that means you might have to release the source code for your software. You might have to give your software for free if you use any dependency that has a copyleft license. So this is the one we've got to be very careful of, because if you do this wrong, you might have to rewrite your whole application, because for some of us, it's just not a possibility to release all our source code for free. I mean, companies, software engineering companies are here to make money. That is what we're here for. We're here to automate the world, make it a better place, but we wouldn't exist, we wouldn't have jobs if they weren't there to make money. And this can be very, very restrictive in regards to that. So be careful with copyleft. And like I said, proprietary, this is the most restrictive one. Basically, it makes it impossible to copy, modify, and distribute this software. And these are things like I said, Microsoft Office, things like that. So a bit of a crossover here, because in my opinion, license management is part of good dependency management. So if you're doing dependency management correctly, you should also be doing license management correctly. And the reason for that is nowadays, open source code, open source dependencies, open source software is in healthcare devices. It is in insulin pumps, the pumps that keep people alive. We have open source code in there. It's in aircraft. It's in self-driving cars. It's in trains. The world is running on free software these days. That is what the world is running on. So there is lots and lots of things we need to consider. So crossing over a little bit to dependency management here, some crazy facts to try and make you think about how you should manage your dependencies better. And again, I classify licenses as part of dependency management. In 2016, for example, cybercrime surpassed the drug trade. So cybercrime was making more money than the worldwide drug trade, right? That was 450 billion US dollars a year. That is 14,000 US dollars a second, and that is equivalent to 50 of the world's biggest nuclear aircraft carriers. Bear in mind, I think the US has 10 of these, and in 2016, cybercrime was making enough money to buy 50 of these. What do we think about 2023? That number gone up, do you reckon? Do you reckon dependency management's even more important these days? Yes, it is. It's now 6 trillion US dollars a year, 200,000 US dollars a second, equivalent to 620 of the world's biggest nuclear aircraft carriers. Bear in mind, the US has about 10 of these. So, as you can imagine, using open source code is great, but it comes with a lot of problems. And if this man was still alive today, I guarantee you he wouldn't be in the drug trade, because everyone in the drug trade ends up getting caught. I mean, we know what happened to him. He got shot, right? How many cyber criminals get caught? How many cyber criminals end up getting shot? Not that many. And these people are homing in on basically our use and our love of open source. I mean, if cybercrime was the GDP of a country, it'd be the third largest country in the whole world. So I'm just trying to kind of scare you all a little bit into paying more attention to managing your dependencies, because 30, 40 years ago, I think only 10% of our applications were probably borrowed code, whereas now 90% of them are. So the first step in knowing how to manage your licenses is taking a look at your current estate, right? I mean, a lot of you are quite young here, so you're all joined a company which probably has a lot of applications that have been running for a while. But do you know what licenses that includes? Do you know what those dependencies, what licenses are attached to those? So this is where software composition analysis can help. Essentially, what this does is it allows you to look into your applications, to look at what's inside, to figure out what open source stuff you're consuming, and then when you've got that information, you can essentially figure out what licenses you've got. So I like to use the cake analogy for this. So I've got an application, and I'm going to say, if I'm going to take Java, I'm a Java developer. So I'm going to say I've got a Java application, and in the POM file, I can see I've downloaded 10 dependencies, right? So in a piece of cake, I can see that a piece of cake has some sponge and some icing, but I can see that just by looking at the cake, right? Same with my Maven POM file. But it's the transistors dependencies, it's the dependencies those pull in. What licenses they include are the things that we need to worry about. So instead of looking at the cake and saying, I know it's made out of this, etc., now I know what the sponge is made out of. It's made of flour, eggs, butter, whatever. And this is what a good SCA tool should do. It should look into your application, not only tell you, for example, what a list of dependencies you have, but it should tell you what dependencies those have, any vulnerabilities and license data with those dependencies. Project scoring, I don't know if any of you are aware of this, is something the OpenSSF Foundation have tried to build, which essentially attaches a project score to every open source library and dependency that is out there based on how popular it is, how quickly they update things, how restrictive the licenses are, things like that. So a good SCA tool will take that into consideration, create visualizations to help you visualize what's good and what's bad, and then produce SBOMs. So hands up, anyone heard of an SBOM here? I presume a few, yeah. So developers are terrible. Actual software developers, no one knows what an SBOM is, but because this is a DevOps conference, I see a few more hands go up here, which is great. SBOMs are great. So it's called a software bill of materials, and it's great to have a software bill of materials, but if you're going to just create one and not do anything with it, then it's a bit pointless, to be honest. But this is something, if you don't know, and you work in the EU, you should know this, because it's going to be mandatory law, I think, in 2024 for you to produce these things. If you worked in certain sectors, and those sectors are pretty much every sector of the IT industry, automotive, aircraft, medicine, banking, blah, 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 blah. They're all going to start requiring this in 2024. That's if the directive passes, etc. Blah, blah. So how can you create an SBOM? SBOMs, there's lots of different free open source tools to do that. Sonatypes 1 is not open source, but there's lots of open source tools to do that if you want to create an SBOM. And essentially, it will list exactly what is in your application. These are not always great, because now people are starting to hack the SBOMs to change what's in our application so they can essentially screw over governments, etc. But at the moment, SBOMs are starting to be mandated. And I'll explain a little bit about the EU law that's going to mandate them at the end of the talk. So some of the main licenses we should all know about. These are the licenses we all probably use every day. So the first two main ones, the ones I come across most, are Apache and MIT. Apache essentially requires copyrights and license notifications on the distributed code, or as a notice in the software. So if you're using anything with an Apache license, you have to include the copyrights in the code or as a separate thing. Larger projects and modifications are allowed to carry different license terms. There are some caveats there. Source code is not required to be included, so a lot of licenses will require you to include the source code as part of using that, and it also contains patent grants. The MIT license, this is probably the most used license in the world. The name comes obviously from MIT, the MIT University in in the US, and it's very, very short and clear. This is why developers, engineers, we all love the MIT license, because it's very clear and very short to the point. It removes liability from the authors. So essentially, if I am the person who created that open source dependency, that library, that license says I am not responsible if you do something with that and something bad happens. So for example, horrible scenario here, it's included in an aircraft, the aircraft has a bug, that open source dependency is the reason why, it crashes, everyone dies. I know, a bit morbid, sorry, it's a bit early for that. But this basic license says I am not liable for that. Now, there's a star there because, like I mentioned, there's legislation coming in the US and EU, which is going to make me liable for that, regardless of what that license says, but I'll talk a little bit about that afterwards. But currently, it removes liability from me if I created it. And again, copyright and license notice are required for modifications and distribution, so you just have to include those with them. So not too hard. Berkeley and unlicensed, so BSD, Berkeley license, this has different levels, so it's pretty much the same as the MIT license at the second level, but then if you add the third level, it's like a second clause, third clause, fourth clause. If you add these clauses in, they add more restrictions. Generally, source code is not required to be distributed with this license. Now, unlicensed, as the name of the license suggests, is the best license. Well, it's the license that basically has no conditions. You can pretty much do what you want. Again, like I mentioned before, not all software without a license falls into this category, so don't assume that is the case. But with this license, you're free to modify, copy, and distribute it. The only thing is, it must be kept in the public domain. So that is pretty much the only caveat. Then we've got the general public license, GPL, and AGPL, or Affero GPL. The general public license, all source code must be distributed under GPL. It's suitable for commercial, patent, and private use. There is a loophole in this license, and that's why this license exists. Essentially, it covers distribution, but it doesn't cover distribution over a network. So there is a kind of weird loophole where you can distribute stuff and not have to abide by the GPL terms. That's where AGPL basically came in to add that one clause to stop that loophole occurring. Then we've got LGPL, EPL, and MPL, so the lesser public, general public license, same terms of GPL and AGPL, preserves copyrights and license notifications, and modified code does not be required, source code does not require the license to be distributed with the project. This is one that I am quite familiar with, working on WebSphere, working with MicroProfile, lots of Eclipse projects. Essentially mainly used for business software. Eclipse was IBM's at one point, that was given to the Eclipse community. Software is under EPL. Software under EPL and non-EPL can be combined and sub-licensed. So essentially what you can do is you can include stuff with the Eclipse license, but as long as you put it in a separate module, you can license those modules or those different parts separately to the main thing you're releasing. So if I was to release my project or my application and it included stuff with this license, all I'd have to do is separate out that code, and I could basically use a different license for my main project and then just license that with the Eclipse license. So you can separate it out. The Mozilla license is pretty much the same. The only difference is patent grants and copyright notice must be included with that license. So those are all the main licenses we had. I've given you the reasons why this stuff's important. Now let's have a look. There's a few licenses we do need to be very, very careful of, and I'll explain why. And again, it's a lot of these GPL and LGPL licenses. Some of them are very popular, like GPL 2.0, GPL 3.0, etc. The problem is you must make any modifications available under these licenses. So like I mentioned, if I use one dependency, bear in mind 90% of my applications are now borrowed code. If I use one dependency that includes one of these licenses, I must release my software with these licenses, which can be a big, big no-no for a lot of companies because it requires me to do certain things like make it free, distribute it on the internet, blah. And a lot of us, we just don't want to distribute our source code. That is our intellectual property. So we have to be very, very careful that we're not including dependencies or anything open source with these licenses and shipping our software with a different license. Because if we do, we could get in a lot of legal trouble. So, for example, some of the things that can go wrong if we do this, if someone wants to go and buy our product or our SaaS software, they're going to look at our license agreement to make sure everything works. You get legal teams that will go and have a look at these things. And the problem is, if they spot problems during the license audit, they might not buy our software. They might say, okay, I can't buy this. There's legal problems here. Other problems, as we might know, being sued for financial liability by the creator of the component. That is a very, very, very big reality. Again, having to rewrite a major part of the product. We could have to rewrite our whole product just to get rid of some libraries we were using because we can't abide by their license terms. We might have to publish our software as open source, which could destroy our business model. If we've spent a lot of time and a lot of intellectual property, spent a lot of money trying to build something, we don't always want to just give it away for free to the world. And if we include the wrong licenses, we might have to. Otherwise, we'll have to rewrite the whole application. Getting penalties and restrictions on selling your software until the compliance is fixed. And again, we could lose reputation with our business. If someone keeps coming to buy software offers and does a license audit, and we keep failing over and over again, they're not going to come back to us. So these are things we do have to be careful of. And unfortunately, licenses are a bit boring. This is not something we want to. We want to innovate. We want to make our businesses run better. We want to improve productivity in our organizations. We don't want to have to sit there going through licenses. And of course, we generally shouldn't as engineers. This is more of a legal thing. But until we notify the right people, the right legal people, etc., that we're using this, they're never going to know. So it's not going to be a problem until it's a problem. And as I've always thought and always said, humans, we're a very reactive race. We react to problems. We don't try and fix them before they become a problem. We react when it's a big problem. Look at global warming. When the world starts frying, of course we're going to fix it. That's what humans do. But until it becomes a very big financial problem where loads of people's lives are in danger, humanity, we're pretty, we like to fix stuff as we go along. And in this case, some of these legal battles can be the end of our companies. So we need to be proactive, otherwise our companies may go under and we may lose our jobs. But don't worry, there is loads and loads of tools to automate this. Of course, I'm from Sonatype, so I'm just going to very, very briefly mention one. Sonatype Lifecycle is a product. Hands up, anyone heard of it, used it before? No? Okay. Okay, cool. So Sonatype Lifecycle is essentially it's a kind of server that sits there and monitors your organization. Licenses are just a small part of this. It mainly looks at every open source dependency you use. And you can set policy violations on it. So if it has a defect in it that's a certain level or a certain threat level, you can say that no developer can pass a build with that. So it hooks into every part of your development lifecycle, from the source code to the repo you're pulling down from, to your internal repo, to when a developer downloads it and builds it on his laptop, to when they build it at, say, GitHub, when it goes into your pipelines. It will monitor at every stage what's going on and what's included. And the same with licenses. So instead of just vulnerabilities, you can get your legal department to go through the licenses, and there are thousands of them. So it's a good job, legal people have to do this. But there are thousands and thousands of them. I think there's something like 10,000 different licenses. But basically, something like this, you can go through and set what's available, and you can say what kind of severity they are. So you can allow certain things to go through into your development organization and some things that aren't allowed through. So as you can see here, you can see pretty much that most of the things we download has a license attached to it, and we can say whether we're happy for that license to be included in our development organization or not. So again, license management is a very, very boring, tedious task. Generally, people don't want to do it, so automate it. That is my advice to you all. Sonatype is not the only company that offers solutions to do this, but it's something we have to do. Same with dependency management, especially nowadays, because all the bad people are trying to attack open source dependencies. Gone are the days where people brute force their way into companies. That's coming to an end. How they're doing it now is they attack open source projects. You go and download that open source project, and then they get in because you made this mistake. You've got a vulnerability, and they can get in. Like Log4j. Now, that wasn't a deliberate attack. That was a mistake. But that was probably the worst one of the worst vulnerabilities in our industry's history, I'd say. And that was a mistake. Everyone pulled it down thinking, oh, no, this is fine. And then all of a sudden, everyone started to get hacked around the world. So again, good dependency management is kind of the same as, having good posture with licensing. Now, I'm not going to go into detail because these are very, very heavy slides. But like I said, we need to be proactive about a lot of these things rather than reactive. Put it this, for example. In the car industry, if I bought a BMW and that BMW had a major fault, for example, it wasn't a BMW, I won't name the manufacturer. I had a car which I got through work. The fault on this car, which they told me that is not, it doesn't need to be recalled, was if you went round a roundabout too quickly, the airbag in the steering wheel would go off. Brand new car, and they did not think that this should go back to the factory. But if it had gone off and I crashed and died, that company would have been liable because they knew about this vulnerability. Whereas in software, nobody's liable for that. And this is why governments around the world are now scratching their heads thinking, shit, we need to make someone liable for this. We can't not make anyone. So guess what? They're all coming together to build cybersecurity acts that make different people liable in different places. The US one, like I mentioned, it will require things like SBOMs. Again, I'm not going to go into this. This is all very heavy and I'm running out of time. But it's basically designed to make people responsible for the things they ship. If I ship something and, like I said, a train crashes because of my bad software, I should be reliable for that. But nowadays, people can get around it and, yeah. So that's the US one. Now, the ones you guys are probably most interested in, oh no. Yes, it is this one. Yeah, so the ones you guys would be interested in, this is the EU one. Now, the problem is with the EU one, and this hasn't been finalized yet, thank God. Basically, it's, in my opinion, is a really, really bad for open source legislation. Essentially, they're making anyone who creates open source software, dependencies, anything, responsible. Do you think that's going to stifle innovation? Am I going to personally go and write some open source code to give to people? If they use it and anything goes wrong with that, I'm the one that's going to go to prison? That is what the current law states. Now, this hasn't actually gone into effect yet, and it is a directive, so it's up to each EU member state to decide whether they want to implement it. And I understand why they're doing it. They're trying to make someone liable. But why would I bother creating open source code? You think Google's going to bother, shipping Kubernetes to Europe if, a bank uses it or a plane manufacturer uses Kubernetes and something goes wrong and then they go and blame Google or the engineers at Google that develop it? They're not. They're probably just going to pull the plug and leave Europe. So again, if you're not aware of this legislation, do, because you still have time to voice this. I'm doing this from outside the EU now, which we were all laughing about the other day, which is a bit of irony. But yeah, essentially do pay attention to this because this could really, really stifle innovation in terms of the tech industry in Europe. So do pay attention. And certain things like SBOMs, like I mentioned before, you will need to produce these and hand them over. Basically detailing exactly what's in your code. Anything that goes wrong, you have to have patches ready and you have to explain when they're coming, what you're doing to fix them, all these kind of things. So just be aware of this legislation because it might affect you. So I'm just going to conclude now because I've got about 9 minutes left. I'll leave some time for questions. Just to summarize, open source usage is increasing. It always will increase, in my opinion, for a very, very long time. And so are the amount of licenses we need to be aware of. Being aware of the contents of your application can not only help with knowing what's in your applications, knowing what licenses you have, but it can help make security better by you knowing what libraries you've got, what vulnerabilities are contained in those. Every time you do an update, any new or updating open source dependency you use, always make sure that a license change has not occurred, because they do like to get them in there without, telling everybody. So it's very easy for us to update a dependency. It's a case of, just going into our POM file or into our build infrastructure and just changing a version number. But that version number change can come with a new license, which could legally open you for a legal battle. So be careful there. And yeah, beware of how upcoming legislation may impact your usage of open source projects, because it's not just the EU. Like I mentioned, the US has got some laws that I think they've already passed. Australia, Japan, India, and I can't remember another country have all teamed up to create their own laws around this, which are passing soon. So just be aware that these laws will affect our industries. And automate everything. We're in the age of automation. We should be automating everything these days. AI, I mean, we all talk about AI, but AI is just automation, really, or it's just automating stuff for us or doing stuff quicker for us than we could previously do by hand. So automate everything, especially the tasks that stifle innovation, especially the tasks that we don't care about. There's some useful links to some of the stuff I talked about here, some stuff about Log4j, attacks, etc. If you want to get in touch with us, Sonatype, we are open on all social media channels, or you can just message me. We have created, if you're aware of Foo.j, it's a really good Friends of Java website. We've created some stuff about first steps for creating SBOMs, how to do composition analysis, things like that. It's a 3-part series, so do check that out. Sonatype also produced something called the Software Supply Chain Report. This has loads of epic information in it. It will tell you all about how dependency usage is going up, how different things are taking over, blah, 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 blah. But basically, we get data from all around the world, all of our customers, etc., and compile it to create this report once a year, so do check it out. I do want to say thank you all for being here. I know it's an early morning one. Again, I don't like mornings, and when I saw the schedule, I was like, oh, I'm first. Oh, okay. But thank you all for being here, especially for a talk to listen to about licenses. So thank you a lot. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you for listening to my talk.